Today on an all-new Dr. Phil. A 22-year-old found murdered in a vacant lot. Her nude body posed and bisected at the waist.
It had to have been a skilled surgeon.
The Black Dahlia remains one of the biggest unsolved murders in American history until now.
Steve says there's new evidence that no one has ever heard before.
We recover soil samples, and they come back positive for human remains.
No need to adjust your TV set. We are taking you back in time to the beginning of a Hollywood murder mystery that has never been solved. These pictures are from 1947. A 22-year-old woman was found murdered in a vacant lot in Los Angeles. Her story became highly publicized due to the graphic nature of the crime, which included her body being mutilated and bisected at the waist. To this day, it is still the most well-known unsolved murder in American history. She was given the nickname the Black Dahlia and was later identified as Elizabeth Short. But who was this mysterious woman? LA historian and tour guide Kim Cooper reveals her story. Take a look.
Everyone who's interested in true crime knows about the Black Dahlia, but she was a real person. She was a person with a name. Her name was Elizabeth Short, and her friends called her Beth. The name Black Dahlia comes from a motion picture that came out the summer before Beth Short was killed, called The Blue Dahlia. Someone said, "Oh, Beth, you're like the Black Dahlia with those black clothes you wear and the flower in your hair," and that became her nickname. Elizabeth was born July 24th, 1924 in Massachusetts. She had 4 sisters. She was the middle child. The Depression was really hard on her dad's business. He just was not able to make a go of it. He actually drove his car to a bridge and left it there and faked his own death. As soon as she was old enough to work, she went down to Miami. As she got a little older, she was missing her father, and she became aware that he was not dead, and in fact, he was in California. So she reached out and asked to come and stay with him. Elizabeth's dad was really not a very nice man. They separated soon after. So after leaving her father, Elizabeth was about 18 years old, and she just proceeded to bounce around, not just California, but America. On one of her trips to Miami, she met this flyer named Matt Gordon. He was in a post-war airplane crash, and he was killed. His death seems to have really sent Beth Short on a terrible depressive spiral. And over my shoulder is the Hotel Brevoort, and this is one of the places where Beth Short stayed when she was dating a guy. They went their separate ways, and then that left Beth Short homeless again. At one point, she was living in Hollywood with a bunch of girls in an apartment. They all had bunk beds, and for the price of $1 a night, you could stay in one of these. If you didn't have $1, you might have to get your luggage and sneak out through the fire escape, and that's what Beth Short did on at least one occasion. For a while, she was working at what's now Vandenberg Air Force Base. At the time, it was Camp Cook. In 1943, she went to Santa Barbara with a bunch of friends to a nightclub. She was sitting at a table with liquor, and they chose to bust her. Because she got arrested, there was a mugshot, and her fingerprints went on file, and that's how she was ultimately identified after she was murdered. In the aftermath of Beth Short's murder, it was a time of mass hysteria. There was a sense that around any corner, there could be a killer. This ends up being kind of a film noir drama that plays out on the front pages of the newspapers. Always remember that she was a human being. She's worth being remembered, not just as a crime victim.
The Black Dahlia has captivated Hollywood for decades. Elizabeth's life and murder has been the topic of countless theories, best-selling novels, television shows, and movies like this 2006 thriller.
Her name was Elizabeth Short. She was young and beautiful, determined to be famous, but destined to be infamous.
No reporters viewed the body.
The victim has been cut in half, all organs removed, blood drained from the body, and the mouth sliced ear to ear.
The story of the Black Dahlia is back gripping the nation yet again with a top-ranked podcast called Root of Evil, the true story of the Hodel family and the Black Dahlia. Why the Hodel family? Because the prime suspect in Elizabeth Short's murder was Dr. George Hodel. His great-granddaughters, Yvette and Rasha, are now revealing the never-before-heard archival audio of some of their family's disturbing secrets.
That's Mom. She sounds so young.
From the age of 12, I knew my story would be written. Why? I had a mother who was a drunk. She detested me, and I detested her drinking. One lie, one little white lie, caused me to fight for the rest of my life.
Well, we'll talk to them later about that lie, but first, let's meet retired LAPD detective and son of the alleged murderer. Here's what he has to say about his now infamous father.
My father was Dr. George Odell. He was a famous physician. He was also the prime suspect and the killer of Elizabeth Short, better known as the Black Dahlia. My dad was head of LA County Health Department, handsome, beautiful speaking voice.
Brown is the river, golden is the sand. It flows along forever with trees on either hand.
In 1949, my mother suddenly places my brothers and I in a military academy. Dad's gone, and we don't know what's happening. We would discover that my half-sister Tamar disclosed that our father had had sex with her. Dad was charged with incest and child molestation and was found not guilty. After 4 years in the Navy, I joined LAPD at 21, 5 years in patrol, 17 in homicide, 300 murder investigations. I served for almost 24 years. My father gets a penthouse in San Francisco. We become very close in that last decade of his life. And then I get that 3 a.m. phone call in 1999 from his wife, June. She says, your father's collapsed, and they've just pronounced him dead. 2 days later, I'm on the phone with my half-sister, Tamar. She says, the LAPD cops that took me back and forth to the trial said, we think your father killed the Black Dahlia. And I said, well, Tamar, there's no way. I said, well, I'm going to be able to establish he had nothing to do with it. But the first thing I discovered is LAPD is confident that the killer was a trained, skilled surgeon. Well, my father was a trained, skilled surgeon, but still, I said, there's no way. The next thing I find out is the Black Dahlia killer is sending taunting notes to the police and the press. This one note, full, non-disguised handwriting. It's my father's handwriting. I've identified it, and so have experts. I relocate back to Los Angeles, and I start a full-bore investigation, like I'm trained to do. The circumstantial case was building on Elizabeth Short. We've got the surgeon, we've got the handwriting, then the description of the suspect that was actually seen at the crime scene. A witness was a half block away, and he saw this 1936 dark sedan. Well, Dad at that time was driving a 1936 black Packard sedan. After digging into it and getting all the witness statements from that time period, I submitted in secret to an active head deputy DA. He came back and he said, based on your investigation, I would file on Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, and I would win it in a jury trial. I get permission to actually examine some secret files. And there's a Hodel file. I find out he was the prime suspect all along, and I find out that they tape recorded our residence. His actual words are, supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia. They can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead. I didn't go to this case. It came to me. This man spread so much horror. The tragedy of it is he could have cured cancer. I mean, he could have done anything. And this dark side, this evil monster within, was the power that rules.
Well, Steve, thank you for being here. You were very close to your father for a long time towards the end of his life, right?
I was.
So this had to be a shock.
More than a shock. It was, I was confident when I started out that I'd be able to exonerate him.
So when was the first time in working the evidence over that it hit you that this really could be my father?
Probably about 1.5 years into the investigation before everything came together, the witnesses, and it all came together to the point when I submitted it to the DA in secret.
Right. Now, there were surveillance recordings of his home in 1950, and some of the recordings were interesting. On February 18th of 1950, one of the things that was heard was put a pillow over her head and covered her head with a blanket. Get a taxi, call Georgia Street, receiving hospital right away. Expired at 12:39. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they might have figured it out. Killed her. Maybe I did kill my secretary. Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead. They had bugged the house?
Right. 18 detectives, 24/7 for 6 weeks. They took my dad in for questioning on the Dahlia case, and while he was in downtown, they put live microphones in the walls, ran a hard line to Hollywood Station 4 miles away, the station I would work for 17 years in homicide when I grew up. And they would sit there recording these recordings 24/7 around the clock for 6 weeks.
Well, so this was his voice saying, put a pillow over her head?
Yeah, these are not phone taps. These are live conversations.
And then he says, don't say anything on the phone. It is tapped. I have your phone number. I will have to go out to call. So he knows that he's being watched.
Well, he thinks the phones are tapped. He doesn't have a clue that they're wired for sound, that the
house is wired.
The house is wired, so he thinks the phone is tapped.
And then at the end of the month, he actually says the words Black Dahlia. He says, I'm in trouble. Black Dahlia, passport, police have pictures of me, and I thought I had destroyed all of them.
Right.
And those are excerpts, but at that point, he thinks they're on to him about that case.
Absolutely. I mean, actually, my mother had been interviewed a few days before.
And he left the country a few days later.
Yeah, she goes, tells him, hey, the police have got photos of you and the girl and stuff, and that they interviewed me, and he splits. He leaves the country at that point.
All right, find out why Steve says his father was not only the Black Dahlia murderer, but a serial killer that has terrorized the nation and even abroad when we come back.
I discovered that he's a serial killer. My dad was also investigated 18 months before the Dahlia murder for the suspected overdose murder of his secretary. There were other murders, too. He was pure evil.
Tomorrow on Dr. Phil. From handsome rapper.
My son, Tivy, was a rock star.
To homeless and on heroin.
You're not in here doing dope. Stop.
His girlfriend even disguises herself to find him.
I dress like a homeless person and wander the streets.
But is his family to blame?
You said he's ruined all of your lives and even killed your stepfather.
I was going to joke, but I'm not.
Oh, you can hide behind humor, but in the meantime, your boy's going to be deader than a hammer.
That's tomorrow.
In 1950, the DA lieutenant's about to file his case against Dad. Dad splits. He goes to Hawaii, becomes a psychiatrist there. He meets and marries a wealthy Filipina. They go on to Manila, and he starts a new life. As the fates would have it, in the Navy, I'm assigned to the Philippines. Dad, at this time, is now divorced. Maybe we drank together and womanized together maybe 6, 8 times during the 2 years. I knew he was obsessed with sex, but other than that, I never saw any violence.
Well, Steve has been investigating America's most well-known murder mystery, the Black Dahlia, for over 2 decades. Now, one thing he never expected was that the murderer would turn out to be, in his opinion, his own father, Dr. George Hodel. But the story only begins there. Steve now says the Black Dahlia wasn't his only victim. Take a look.
Not only does it look like he's the killer of Elizabeth Short, but I discovered that he's a serial killer. My dad was also investigated 18 months before the Dahlia murder for the suspected overdose murder of his secretary. It was listed as a suicide. They couldn't prove it. There were other murders, too. 3 weeks after the murder of Elizabeth Short, there was another murder, and it's Jean French. Her body was nude, posed on a vacant lot about 5 miles west of the Dahlia crime scene. She was blunt force trauma to the head, just like the Dahlia was. And the killer took a lipstick and wrote an obscenity, you, and signed it BD for Black Dahlia. Then there was a Louise Springer, who was kidnapped just 2 blocks away from the Dahlia crime scene. She was strangled, she was sexually assaulted, and brutally beaten to death. That's another one they're saying is definitely connected. He was an urban terrorist. He terrorized Los Angeles, sending in the taunting notes to the police and the press. He was an extreme narcissist. He wanted to remain above the fold in the newspapers. I see him as a misanthrope, a classic sadist. He hated women. He was pure evil.
Well, Steve's talking about the personality of his own father. And, you know, while we're on that topic, I want to add to our conversation Dr. Robert Shug, a forensic psychologist and professor of criminology at Long Beach State University. Obviously, this is a very intelligent guy, right?
Seems to be. I mean, I think we can sort of look at how the crime scene evidence suggests the type of person that would do this, and then we can also look at your dad and see how good of a fit he is for someone who might commit this type of murder. Yeah. And so when we look at the crime scene, we definitely, you know, it suggests anger, hostility, even hatred of women. It suggests sort of sexuality fused with aggression. It suggests someone who is a bright person, yet at the same time can control their impulses and plan and organize. It suggests someone, as you said, with medical knowledge, knowledge of anatomy, someone who's a bit callous and lacking empathy, right, in terms of the pre-mortem torture, as well as the posing in public for some sort of unsuspecting passerby to be traumatized by. And then, as you said, Steve, the narcissism, along with the brazen act of posing the body and then taunting the police and the media afterwards. He wanted this to be found, and he wanted to make a statement.
When we look at the crime scene photo, we see that there was some real exhibitionistic type posing, and this was out meant to be found, meant to have shock value. The body was cut in half, and they said, and that's not easy to do, by the way.
No.
This does take somebody with some skill, right?
It's called a hemicorpectomy, and there's a specific vertebrae that you have to cut through with a scalpel, and they teach this, or at least they taught this in medical schools at that time. So it's a sophisticated amount of knowledge to be able to even pull this off.
Yeah, so this wouldn't have been an impulse.
Doesn't seem like it, and also adding to that, I think the washing and cleansing of the body, the scrubbing it to remove fingerprints, the sort of way in which it was dragged and posed, it doesn't really line up with someone who was doing this spur of the moment, not thinking before they act.
Yeah. And he was a very meticulous, methodical sort of guy.
Well, he was a trained surgeon to begin with, so he certainly had the skill, and there was no question in LAPD and the experts' minds that it had to have been a skilled surgeon.
And he was taunting the police, someone was taunting the police, whether it was the killer or someone that was posing as the killer or whatever, but if he was taunting the police, that would be consistent with this narcissistic...
Very much. This grandiosity and this arrogance that Steve talks about that he actually witnessed.
Yeah, all of these notes he wanted to be above the fold in the newspapers. I mean, this was a very important part of his egotism and his narcissism.
Well, coming up, Steve says there's new evidence that no one has ever heard before that proves his father was a serial killer. His latest discovery next.
I had an opportunity to go to the Franklin house and actually do some forensic investigation. We recover soil samples, and they come back positive for human remains. The three biggest myths of the Dahlia investigation is that it was a standalone murder. Absolutely not. LAPD was going full bore, actively investigating 5 or 6 of them. They were linking them all together. Another myth is that the case was never solved. It was solved. As we know from the secret files, it was about to be filed when Dad split. Then there's the third myth. Elizabeth Short supposedly had a missing week where she was never seen and then her body was found. She was seen every day of that week. The last person that saw her was a policewoman who stopped and talked to her, who I interviewed 50 years later, and says it was absolutely Elizabeth Short. This was 8 hours before she was slain.
Well, Steve is a retired LAPD detective determined to clear his father's name of the most notorious unsolved murder in America, the Black Dahlia. But he says to his horror, 20 years later, the evidence against his father just keeps piling up. Take a look.
Back in the original investigation, they suspected that there were bodies buried at the house as early as 1950. I had an opportunity in 2012 and then again in 2013 to go to the Franklin house and actually do some forensic investigation. Buster is this cadaver dog who's highly trained. I have an opportunity to meet with him and his handler. We meet out front of the residence and gives him the command to search. Buster runs up the steps and alerts on a vent in the basement. And he alerts at 4 different locations. And we recover soil samples. They come back positive for human remains. In in November 2018, we went back, Dr. Voss and I, and he had an instrument that called an Inquisitor. Will actually pick up human remains. It registered human bone, probably in the basement, and then another probably outside or up the hill. This is science speaking, and it says that there are human bones somewhere in or around the property. This is confirming what the original 1950 detectives believed.
Well, joining us on Skype is retired detective Paul Dostie, who went to the Franklin house with Steve and his dog, made a discovery. So was this a surprise to you? I mean, this has been a long time. Was it a surprise to you that the dog was able to make the hit?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about the Black Dahlia at the time, but after talking to Steve and realizing who I was working with, I thought, wow, what a great opportunity. And, you know, I just let the dog do what he does, didn't tell him to do anything special, and he went around and alerted. I got a really good hit in the alley behind the Black Dahlia house, and indicating there's something uphill, which was a vacant lot at the time that Hodel lived there. I took a sample, soil sample there, because you know gravity will push those decompositional chemicals downhill, and so I could get it in a soil sample, and that came back positive for human decomposition.
And you say that to dig up the site and the remains to be tested for DNA, they need permission from the property owners and a search warrant, right?
Yes. They've not been cooperative in granting us permission to do that. However, you know, we don't know if it's one or two people. We just know that it is Caucasian bone that we're detecting at both locations.
Now, he was a fan and friends with Man Ray, right?
Yes, he was our family photographer.
We see here Man Ray's Minotaur, and then Elizabeth Short's upper body was posed in a very similar posture.
Right. One of the early clues was my recognizing, going through Man Ray's artworks and seeing this exact, you know, picture of a woman bisected at the waist, carefully posed, which is one of his most famous artworks called the Minotaur. And it's identical to, of course, to the crime scene. And this is Dad's surrealistic, you know, his masterpiece. I talk about, you know, his scalpel being his paintbrush, and her body was, you know, his canvas. It's that twisted.
Is part of him wanting to get caught, or is he just so arrogant that he thinks he's going to get away with this?
Probably a little bit of both, I would imagine. There are some psychological theorists who talk about criminals who commit crimes to get caught, right? But in this sense, I believe it's more about sort of arrogance and narcissism.
One of the clues that kind of indicates, I think, a part of him did want to get caught was of the dozen notes he sent in, he's only sent in one that was undisguised in his handwriting, which I recognized later on. Yeah. And it said, turning myself in on January 29th, had my fun at the police, signed Black Dahlia Avenger. And that was undisguised handwriting. And I think he really, at that point, was going to actually turn himself in, but changed his mind. Man
Ray had another piece that had this crisscross, and this was actually on Elizabeth Short's right hip.
Again, another crime signature by my father, actually using a scalpel to cut that into the hip, taking it from his good friend's painting from 1943. We actually have strong indications that she could well have posed for Man Ray in 1943 for that painting. We have documentation where she posed for other paintings in 44. So, you know, she could well have been I believe she was the model in 43 for Man Ray, and had met him either through my father or my father met her through Man Ray, I don't know which.
Wow. All right, coming up, we'll meet the great-granddaughters of Dr. George Hodel, and they'll tell us the dark family secrets they found in their mother's storage facility next.
I've never not known about the Hodel family or the Black Dahlia. The only grandmother I've ever known is Tamar Hodel, and that came with a lot of stories.
Well, sex, lies, and audio tapes are what two sisters found in their mother's storage facility after she passed away. Now, this newly uncovered special content is airing for the very first time in the Cadence 13 podcast, Root of Evil. The True Story of the Hodel Family and the Black Dahlia, co-hosted by sisters Yvette and Rasha. Take a look.
Yvette and I are sisters. We're not twins. We have different fathers, but we were raised by the most amazing human on the planet, Fauna Hodel.
Yes.
My mom worked her entire life to tell her life story and brought my sister and I along on this journey.
For years, we knew that Mom had a ton of stuff. In this storage container was her whole life.
Every single clue. Tons of audio of her and Tamar.
I met my mother's mom, Tamar, when I was about 7 years old.
I found out I was pregnant. And I told my mother, and she said, don't ask me to help you in any way. After what you've done to your father, you're on your own.
We only went through it a few months after Mom died. And so she came back to life for us.
Mama was black and I was white. Growing up in the late 50s and early 60s with such odds, I knew if we outlived the circumstances, this would be a story to tell.
The biggest surprise I got from the tapes was listening to Tamar and our mom, Fauna, talk about the very first sexual experience Tamar had with her father, George Hodel.
It's like you just can't wrap your brain around it.
I've never not known about the Hodel family or the Black Dahlia or our family's connection to it, especially because the only grandmother I've ever known is Tamar Hodel. And that came with a lot of stories about our family.
She would say, my father, George Hodel, was this wealthy, rich, charismatic man, and by the way, he also was the Black Dahlia murderer.
I'd be like, well, what do you mean he killed the Black Dahlia? Or what do you mean you slept with your father? Or what do you mean he killed other people? There were no family secrets in the Hodel family. However, there are. I mean, we still truly don't know who our mother's biological father is. We only knew the tip of the iceberg. We didn't know everything. George Hodel did a lot of things left out in plain sight to make it clear that he killed Elizabeth Short. One of them, he named his granddaughter Deborah Elizabeth, after Elizabeth Short. So when we found out that our podcast was called Root of Evil, we were a little taken aback because we were like, we're not the root of evil. We're like, oh, but George Hodel was the root of all evil. And yes, we might descend from that root of evil, but
that will never define who we are.
Well, thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
So, your mother passed when?
17 months ago.
Okay, I'm very sorry for your loss, by the way. And so you started, of course, going through her things as we do when we lose our parents, and you came upon some of these tapes.
My mother had had a storage unit for many, many years, and she saved everything. She was the Nancy Drew in her own story, you know, of finding her truth. And the things that we uncovered were just like...
It was a lot.
It was a lot. Yeah, it was a lot.
And she refers to one lie. What is the one lie?
Tamar lied on our mom's birth certificate and said that our mom's father was, well, at the time, she said Negro, because it was 1951 that our mom was born. So our mom thought she was biracial. And then she discovered she was adopted and realized not only was she not biracial, but she found out why Tamar lied. In Tamar's mind, she thought, well, I'm white and my family was awful to me, but she was close to, you know, people who were African American.
And that's the story that we had heard for many years, is Tamar had always said that she was close to the maids and the servants, and the black people were always, you know, embracing her, and she wanted her child to be in a loving environment.
Do you know who was your mother's father?
No.
We don't know.
I know what she told me. She said he was a Italian-American in San Francisco, you know, that had raped her. Now, you got to understand, she'd been totally sexualized at 14 by my father.
After your father died, why did your sister apologize to you?
She actually had sex with me when I was 8 years old. She was 14. So that's what she's apologizing for on the phone. She's saying, I'm sorry about that. I've never had an opportunity The irony is I had no memory of it.
So this was not the Partridge Family.
No, polar opposite.
Hardly.
With lies, incest, violence.
Exactly.
Well, I've got some questions for you guys after the break. We'll be right back. Is there any doubt in your mind whether George Hodel is the killer?
No doubt.
No doubt.
Absolutely no doubt.
No doubt.
And you believe he is also a serial killer beyond the murder of the Black Dahlia. You think he is also guilty of other murders as well?
Yeah. It was like a casual thing. Oh, yeah, like I had a relationship with my father, and oh, yeah, he killed the Black Dahlia and other women.
And then listening, you know, to Steve give all the details, it just makes sense.
So why has this been unsolved for so long?
This was solved back then. I uncovered their solution, LAPD's, from these secret tapes that were hidden, secret transcripts. But the key to understanding is, in the third day of the transcripts, there's a murder that occurs at the Franklin house. George Hodel and a second man go downstairs to the basement. An object is hits a body, a woman screams. More blows, she screams again. And I'm reading this is live. And I'm saying, why aren't aren't they out the door? They're 4 minutes away. Why aren't they out the door over and making a rescue? I mean, I can't believe my eyes when I'm reading this. And of course, this is confirmed by a few days later. The detectives are checking on, was there anything buried in the basement and stuff. So they're confirming that they believe a body was buried. But they take no action, so they lock it away.
Yeah, because when you look at it, I mean, and it's a very collapsed time here. We're talking about February 18th, 1950, at the Hodel house. This is on the tape, 4:20 p.m. Woman asking for operator several times, sounded as though she was crying. 4:25, woman asking for operator again, said something not heard to the operator. 8:20, sounded as though two men went down steps and entered the basement and began digging. Something was referred to, not a trace. It also appeared as a pipe was being hit. 8:25, woman screamed. 8:27, woman screamed again. I mean,
and they're doing nothing.
And they're on surveillance, and they hear a victim screaming in the house.
Yeah.
Why would, if they're doing surveillance, why not act on what they're surveilling?
Exactly. They're 5 minutes away. That's the facts. I mean, that's the transcript.
Well, have they ever figured out who that woman was?
No. She remains unknown. We don't know if she was buried there. We don't know if he disposed of the body elsewhere. You know, she was probably, you know, earlier on the tape you hear them saying, does your husband know you're here? So I'm convinced that Dad drugged her because that was a regular part of his thing. And then, of course, we advance a couple hours later and she's beaten.
Well, is it possible that that's something the dog hit on?
Could she be buried there? Yeah, I mean, it's possible, you know, but we're talking about a dozen L.A. lone woman victims during that time period from 43 to 50 when Dad splits. And LAPD was actively investigating at least 5 of these as being connected.
Well, Rasha and Yvette's mother set out to find her biological family because she said the pages of her life story were blank. Did she ever regret finding out where she came from? They'll tell us next.
I felt from the beginning that you had unconsciously felt that I gave you away. That was just an inner feeling that I'd given you away.
I told you all along that that had nothing to do with it. My situation with you was solely upon the very first time I came to Hawaii, and I felt there's a real manipulative vibration about you, and that's why I only stayed in that house for 6 days. I didn't like what I was seeing. I felt uncomfortable in it.
Dr. George Hodel was the #1 suspect in the Black Dahlia murder, according to his son, Steve, who stumbled upon evidence from the LAPD. He wasn't looking to convict his father in his mind. He was looking to actually clear his name and was really surprised when he found what he found. Now, Rasha and Yvette Dr. Hodell's great-granddaughters discovered their mother's haunting life story on audio tapes and are now sharing what it means to have the Hodell bloodline. You know, when you learned a lot about her from these tapes that you didn't know, right?
Yeah, our mom was very open with us.
We knew a lot. But there's things that, you know, we had never heard before.
She protected us a lot, too. Yeah. Our mom was a shining ray and beam of light.
Yeah, despite, you know, where she came from. I mean, she was adopted and given to a black family, you know, a white child, dealing with racism on both ends of the spectrum, and then finding the truth about her real family and thinking that it was her real family was like Doris Day, white picket fence,
or the Partridge
Family, and it was anything but.
What's been the hardest part that you've learned and had to accept that you didn't know before?
Listening to all the details of what George Hodell did. I mean, what George Hodell did to his daughter, you know, that changed her psyche for the rest of her life. What she endured, what her father did to her.
Mm-hmm. And then she repeated it, unfortunately.
Yeah.
The good side is that her children have all, you know, risen above that, and
they stopped the cycle.
They've had terrible, terrible traumas, you know, with Tamar's raising of them. They had to suffer a lot, and they've all of them have overcome that, and
they're amazing human beings.
They
all
are.
of them.
They are.
And great
to
parents.
be proud of.
Yeah.
So you're not linked to your dark destiny necessarily. You can overcome it.
Absolutely.
You have that free choice.
Well, we say in Texas, you got to rise above your raisin.
Yes.
You gotta get up. So why did you decide to share this story publicly, podcast, TV, whatever? What made you decide to share the story?
Our mom actually, before she died from breast cancer, she'd been working on this her entire life.
What do you want people to take away from your mother's story?
That you can rise above anything and everything, and you can always be the good instead of evil.
Yvette wants to know how a family heals after such disturbing revelations. I mean, every family has their secrets, every family has their baggage. And, you know, where do you put that? I mean, do you deny it? Do you compartmentalize it? What do you do with all that? We'll talk about that after the break. Did George Hodell ever pay any price? Was he ever held to account for any of the things that you believe that he's done?
Not really. I mean, he lived 91 long years, wealth, comfort.
There's this generational legacy, and truly it's passed on. And if you really have a toxic generation and it contaminates the next generation and contaminates the next generation, and you know what you do about it is I always say you can't change what you don't acknowledge, but if you acknowledge it and you label it and you make an active choice to say that stops here.
Right.
That doesn't go, and that's what your mother did.
Yeah.
So that stops here. That doesn't go into this generation, and so therefore it didn't go into your generation, and therefore it won't go into the next. So you've done in not living in shame and suffering it, but instead talking about it, giving it a name, labeling it, saying this stops here. I have a choice, and I make a choice to choose a different path, to choose a different life. And I think giving it a voice and talking about it and putting it out there, I think monsters live in the dark. And
Absolutely.
I think when you turn the bright lights on them and you say, wow, I do have a choice, and you make it, because you know clearly you've got hopefully one in a millions and millions here with somebody that clearly a genius that turned it all for bad, but you don't have to give your power away to something like this, and you choose different, and that's what's happened here. So I know you didn't want to find this, but finding it, and it probably has given closure to a lot of families that have wondered what the hell happened. And by turning
I believe
it out,
that. That's why I've done what I've done.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm glad you did. Well, thank you all for being here and talking about
Thank you,
this.
Dr.
It makes
Phil.
a difference.
Thank you so much.
And a special thanks to Dr. Robert Shug. Thank you so much for being here. And retired detective Dr. Paul Dostie and L.A. historian Kim Cooper. We appreciate all of the help from them. Kim has a Black Dahlia historical tour, so those that are fascinated with this story might want to check that out. For more information about today's show, you can log on to drphil.com. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can listen to my podcast, Fill in the Blanks. And Root of Evil is something that will really give you some insight into what's going on here. It's absolutely terrific. I think you will be fascinated by listening to it. We'll see you next time.